Thank you for inviting me to this conference and this very important topic. Am I audible? I don't see myself on the screen, so I was like, okay, great. I'll be speaking about, and I'm very happy to be speaking at a conference where people already know a little bit about Abdul Ghaffar Khan, and thank you very much to the introduction that you gave me. And obviously, the Khudai Khidmatgars are somebody that at least the name is familiar. And to John Butt, who went into sort of the Deobandi background of Abdul Ghaffar Khan. And so this is, I'm going to share my screen. So I'm talking about a very, one of the first and the largest nonviolent armies that was formed, not just in British India at the time of the nationalist movement, but very much so. It's a unique organization in the world, I would say, and hasn't been replicated at the many levels in which they explored the framework of nonviolence. And I'm just going to, I'll come back to the designation of the very cartographic designation of the area as the Northwest Frontier Province. But I want to first start with this very iconic picture of the Khudai Khidmatgar movement that was started in 1929 by Abdul Ghaffar Khan, also known as Bacha Khan in the vernacular. And in this very iconic photograph, you see him standing, the very tall person at the front wearing white. But this photograph was taken at the height of the movement in the 1930s, early 1930s. And you can see that not only do they have uniforms, but they also had military rankings. And they also had training camps, special training camps in which they were trained in nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience tactics. But alongside with that, so I'm going to point to the many layers of resistance that they engaged with and why it's such a unique organization, is that it was not just what we would in the modern day call a peacekeeping force. This nonviolent army engaged not just in civil disobedience tactics, the strike and the boycott, but also, to use Gandhi's terminology, the constructive programs of village sanitation. The education in the frontier was a huge component of the movement, and that educational component was started by Abdul Ghaffar Khan, actually through Sheikh al-Hind's prodding and through King Amanullah. So it was a cross-border alliance, and there was another figure, the Haji of Turangzai, who was in the tribal territories. And so this was an organization that preceded the Khudai Khidmatgars. And so the Azad schools, which is the educational system that then the Khudai Khidmatgars took over, was a huge component and actually preceded this movement. And the Khudai Khidmatgar movement came about in Bacha Khan's writings. In his autobiography, he says he starts the movement as a social reformation of the Pashtuns, and their valorization of violence was central to it. But the education component, and especially the education of women and their coming into to bring women into the public sphere, out of the private sphere and into the public sphere, was the central motivation behind the organization that was formed. And not only is this a silenced history about the Khudai Khidmatgars, but the women that participated in the movement are sort of doubly silenced, to use Spivak, Gayatri Spivak's term, where women are silenced even within the local registers and not just the global ones. So so as I said, his name is Abdul Ghaffar Khan, is also called Bacha Khan in the vernacular, and I'll go into the meaning of that term in the vernacular. It's often translated as Badshah Khan, a king of Khans, but there is another more nuanced meaning in the vernacular which points to him as a Sufi mendicant figure. And so Bacha in Pashto also is a reference to that, and not just to sort of political power, but a different form of power. And I'm going to get to that in a moment. But the title of Frontier Gandhi, and of course the Khudai Khidmatgar movement, here's another very historic picture of the Khudai Khidmatgars with their uniforms, and these uniforms were dyed a brick red color, even though they were homespun uniforms. But you can see it looks very much like the British Army uniforms, but because it was made from homespun, they were part of the civil disobedience where they would boycott buying of foreign cloths. But because it was dyed a brick red color, they're also called the red shirts. And the colonial authorities, of course, identify them because of that red color as Bolsheviks, even though they had no ties to Russia or communism. But that was one of the reasons for their very harsh policing of that territory. But the title of Frontier Gandhi, and I'll go into the designation of the frontier in just one moment. But Frontier Gandhi suggests, and a lot of autobiographies of Ghaffar Khan and the little bit of literature that is out there suggests that he is sort of a copy of Gandhi, and he has taken Gandhian ahimsa and translated it into the vernacular. But as I mentioned before, this was a many-layered resistance, and one of the key components that I will be focusing on was their literary resistance, or their epistemological resistance against both depictions of the Pashtuns as a intrinsically violent people, as a warrior race. This is the 19th century colonial sort of designation of the Pashtuns, but also internalized by the Pashtuns themselves in many ways. So there's always this suspicion, even when Gandhi visits the frontier, as he does here. He interrogates the Khudai Khidmatgars as to whether their nonviolence is actually authentic, or whether they're taking it on for tactical and strategic reasons. In other words, is it a principled belief in nonviolence and an altered way of life that they have embraced? Or whether are they just following Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who is then in turn following his ideology of nonviolence? And in looking at their literature, their vernacular literature, one realizes that there is a different kind of explanation. This would not explain this phenomena of at the height of the movement, apparently in their own literature, it says that there were 100,000 strong volunteers in the army. But every person in the province, in the Northwest Frontier province at least, had either somebody who belonged to a family member who belonged directly to the Khudai Khidmatgars, or a family member who was part of it in some fashion, or contributed through the literary aspect of it or other aspects of it. And of course, also the Khudai Khidmatgars then formed in alliance with the All India National Congress Committee, were elected into office twice when elections were held in the Northwest Frontier province to form the Frontier Congress Committee. And let me just quickly explain the designation of Northwest Frontier, if for those who may not be familiar with it. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's sort of this area right here, the border between Afghanistan and British India. This is a map of British India. This border over here is was designated as the North, very cartographic terms by colonial authorities as the Northwest Frontier. And this was a three-layered, very strategic border in a sense, because Afghanistan was also considered a buffer state between Imperial Russia and then Imperial India, and Imperial Russia was always considered a threat to this imperial power. And so this was then a very crucial border territory, but as I said, it was three layers. One was Afghanistan, and one right at the border is the tribal territories, ostensibly a autonomous state from British India. And I'm saying ostensibly because there's other reasons why it was policed so brutally than the other areas of India. And after this tribal territories, which would be described more like the ethnographic term of non-state space, I'm sorry, the anthropological term that John Scott uses as a non-state space. So it wasn't fully incorporated into British India, but right next to the tribal territories, then the third layer of that border is the Northwest Frontier Province itself, which was incorporated into British India, but also formed a liminal border territory and was very harshly policed than the rest of India. And so one of the reasons for the silencing of this history, and there are several of them, but I just want to mention just a few, is that this was a very crucial border territory, and the Pashtuns were policed very harshly because they were, in a sense, resisting British colonial representations of the Pathans as a virile warrior race that were then recruited into the British Army. And yet here there were that the largest nonviolent resistance movement was comprised of the Pashtuns, and who took up the mantle of nonviolence within a few years. So the organization was formed in 1929, and this picture was taken in the beginning of the 1930s. It's not clear exactly the date of it. But the 1930s are sort of the crucial turning point where the organization turns from a social reformation movement just of the Pashtuns and becomes an anti-colonial resistance movement and joins the All India National Congress Party as their frontier branch. And so so the explanation, sorry, to go back to this picture, so the explanation that this was merely a copy of Gandhian Ahimsa does not really make legible the fact that the Pashtuns embraced nonviolence with such alacrity and so readily as a way of life. Because Mukhaliki Banerjee's book, The Pathan Unarmed, she goes and interviews the few remaining Pathans, the few remaining Khudai Khidmatgars alive during that, when she was doing her dissertation research in the 1980s. And they still, and she has interviews of them where they recount how they still consider themselves Khudai Khidmatgars, and the vow that they take upon joining the army. They believe that vow of nonviolence was a lifelong commitment. And so my explanation when I was doing my research led me to a different kind of conclusion than that was Abdul Ghaffar Khan was merely replicating Gandhian Ahimsa, because their own literature, and I'm going to turn to that right now. This was their the Pashtun Risala was their mouthpiece of the Khudai Khidmatgar movement, and this is where a lot of the epistemological resistance that I'm talking about, and I'll be focusing on for the rest of my talk, takes place. And this is where most of the women also are contributing their poetry. And it's a lot of resistance poetry that they are speaking of. But the interesting fact to note in this resistance literature is that the term nonviolence, or Adam Tashaddud as they call it, is not mentioned as frequently as one would think, as a justificatory kind of rhetoric, like now the Pashtuns are becoming nonviolent, so let's explain what nonviolence is, which is what I was sort of expecting to find when I started my research. But very surprisingly, the term does not occur very frequently, and generally the articles that are written explaining Pashtun nonviolence are done from people who are not part of the region. And the women's literature in particular does not focus on nonviolence at all. So there is no explanation of nonviolence, and yet it is the framework of nonviolence as an alternate meaning-making framework that they utilize, and through that they situate or explain nonviolence through both Islam, vernacular Islam, their familiarity with Islam. I don't want to designate Islam as a homogeneous kind of entity here in any way, shape, or form, but the vernacular Islam and the codes of Pashtunwali, which John also referred to. So Pashtunwali is essentially a way of being a Pashtun. And they're oral codes, unwritten codes, but they sort of govern social, political, moral, normative behavior, essentially. And so the women are in particular situated in the discourse of Islam as an emancipatory power, if you will, that the Pashtuns have not recognized and do not embody authentically. Because when Islam came, it gave women rights on par with men. That's their rhetoric. And the Pashtuns, because they are still not giving women their rights, but are segregating them and not allowing them to be educated or not allowing them to come into the public sphere, are essentially paralleled with pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah, so the pre-Islamic age of ignorance, whereby, and this is through Muslim historiography, the pre-Islamic Arab tribes would practice female infanticide. And so there's a very interesting parallelism that the women articulate between archaic Pashtun tribal customs and pre-Islamic tribal customs. And then nonviolence is situated in the Enlightenment that Islam brings about. So that's another parallelism that is going on very comfortably, and nobody seems to feel the need to justify that kind of a parallelism either. So I'll start with, I'm going to go into the vernacular literature now, and I'm going to start with Alif Jan Khattak, who was a prolific contributor to the Pakhtun Journal. She wrote many articles and actually won a prize on why women should no longer be veiled. And Abdul Ghaffar Khan would praise her, sort of her endeavor in that kind of resistance. And I'm going to start with one of her poems that was published in the Pakhtun Journal, an appeal to Pashtun girls. You made necklaces, shackles, and handcuffs their music. God only knows what crime they are being caged for. The Quraysh girls were better off than yours. Their fathers would bury them when just alive. But you've been half under the earth since childhood and sold in your youth at someone else's whim. Come and tear the chains from around your neck if you want to spread the rays of honor in the world. So she begins with a critique of the idea of femininity, because a woman, a South Asian woman in particular, her jewelry or her adornment is a symbol of her femininity. And so she's pointing out that idea of the feminine is what is actually shackling and handcuffing us. And so the rhetorical question is that why are we being caged? What is the crime that we've been committed, that we've been caged? And the reference to the cage is to the separate Zanana quarters in women in which traditional Pashtun women are sort of spend most of their lives and do not come out into the public sphere, at least not unveiled, and very rarely for any other purpose than meeting other women or socializing. So the Quraysh girls, the second couplet here, the second share, the Quraysh girls were better off than yours, is of course a reference to the Prophet Muhammad's tribe, the Quraysh, and this is a reference to that tradition that Islamic historiography describes as the pre-Islamic Arabs committing female infanticide. So she's saying they were better off than us because their fathers would bury them just when they were born. But we, in the third couplet, we, the Pashtun women, are buried since childhood and then sold at someone else's whim. And the selling is, of course, not a literal selling, but the giving away of girls in marriage for a bride price and without her consent, in other words. But the last share is really interesting, and here the nonviolence, the framework of nonviolence, becomes visible suddenly, without, of course, a direct reference to it, because she's now pointing to the women themselves to not collaborate with their own subjugation and to take action in liberating themselves from it. So come and tear the chains from around your neck if you want to spread the rays of honor in the world. And the word for honor that's in the last misra, the last line of that couplet at the end, is very particular to the code of Pashtunwali also. It's called nang. And that honor, that form of nang, is always associated with a restoration of honor through acts of retribution or revenge. So you restore your honor if you have been dishonored and a member of your family, or you have been a member of your family has been killed, or you have been insulted, or for some other reason. But in Khudai Khidmatgar literature, this word nang gets resituated into the framework of nonviolence, and this becomes now the new way in which the Pashtun will gain honor, and they will become more Pashtun, because the more nang you have, the more Pashtun you are, the more you're practicing Pashtunwali is through the framework of nonviolence. And I'll be going into another poem that situates nonviolence more deliberately in Pashtunwali. And this is another poem by another woman, Khudai Khidmatgar, Sayyida Bushra Begum, another very prolific contributor to the Pashtun Journal. And this again is referencing modern Muslim nations. So I did not see in Iran, Egypt, Iraq, or Turkey that parda which changed my hands and feet today. And parda is constantly being referred to as a form of incarceration, which is really interesting. But then contrasted with these Muslim nations, so the modern Muslim nations, who are also part of the Muslim framework, but not subjugating their women. So the women have been emancipated. And in the Pashtun Journal, there's constant references to Turkey and Egypt in particular. And in Afghanistan, of course, also during the time of King Amanullah and Queen Soraya, as modern Muslim nations where women are out in the public sphere, do not have to be veiled, and are being educated. And that is not considered an affront to Islam in any way, shape, or form. And so it's a critique of their own local patriarchal tradition, which thinks that women being educated would be a dishonorable act. And then the last couplet in this poem, the voice of my pen is raising Pashtun women's awareness. Without doubt, this is a great offense for the Afghans. Well, the Afghan here is a reference to the Pashtuns. So the Pashtun and the Afghan were two terms that were synonymous before the creation of the nation state, modern nation state of Afghanistan. And so the Pashtun and Afghans are referred to in the same terminology in earlier literature. So one of the titles of another title of Abdul Ghaffar Khan is actually Fakhr Afghan, or Pride of the Afghans. So that is also a vernacular title that he was given. So here, when she talks about the voice of my pen as the really crucial instrument, this is what engages again the framework of nonviolence, and that has given her the power through the Pashtun Journal to create this other kind of reference, a frame of reference for Pashtun women now. And this awareness is what is causing problems for Pashtun local patriarchy and their surprisingly lack of objection to this kind of rhetoric also. So that's also another interesting thing to note, that because they're situated within their own cultural ethos and critiquing it from within, there was not that much objection to their discourse, even though here she is saying that's a great offense for the Afghans. She's talking more generally rather than specifically a critique to her. So I'm going to turn now to another very famous Pashtun poet, Abdul Ghani Khan. And Abdul Ghani Khan is also the eldest son of Abdul Ghaffar Khan, Bacha Khan's eldest son, but also in his own right a very prolific poet. But he has surprisingly very little directly about nonviolence or the Khudai Khidmatgar movement, even though he was quite heavily involved in it at the time. But there is one poem that is titled Adam Tashaddud, or Nonviolence. And that one really situates the framework of nonviolence within the ethos of Pashtunwali and how it was embodied and seen in the local registers. So I want to get to that one. I'll start by reading in Pashto, the poetry, and then I'll translate just for you to get the rhythm of it. Mori igdi pasar Quran bia, Mori igdi pasar Quran bia, Khore karle sargi tore, the Baba Puhtano sturgo, warta ukre kise nore. Mothers place Qurans on their heads. Once again, sisters have blackened their eyes. Baba's Pushtun vision told them tales of another kind. So the first couplet, mothers place Qurans on their heads, is pointing to a particular code of Pashtunwali called Nanawati. And Nanawati literally means to enter in, and it's a code that refers to processes of reconciliation, of forgiveness, especially between two feuding families that have been engaged in long cycles of revenge and retribution, violent revenge and retribution. So this couplet is not only then talking about the code of Nanawati, but because this addresses another code with which the Pashtuns, or the Pathans as they're called also by in colonial literature and South Asian literature, a lot of ethnography describes the Pashtuns as engaging in badal, and the code of badal, and that is the code of revenge or retribution, where they're honor bound to take revenge or retribution if they have been dishonored or violently attacked by another family, clan, or tribe, or so on. But that is the only sort of explanation of the Pashtunwali code, and it is used generally to explain how the Pathan is intrinsically violent, because he takes the law into his own hands and goes and kills his enemy or whoever he thinks has dishonored him. And this line is then resituating, in a sense. Ghani Khan is not mentioning the code of Badal, but is mentioning the code of Nanawati instead, which is now resituating what it is that is important for the Pashtuns. So the way in which Nanawati is engaged is for the elder woman in one household and the two feuding households. For the elder woman in one of the household, and that's the reference to the mothers, the mother places a Quran on her head and goes to the enemy's household. The Quran on her head signifies her sincerity for opening up a dialogue with the enemy and for asking for forgiveness or for an opening to reconcile with that family. And so when she goes to the enemy's household with a Quran on her head, they are obliged to let her in. They cannot refuse her entry or say anything that would dishonor her in any way. So when she enters in, that is the literal meaning of Nanawati, when she enters into the household, then that begins a process of dialogue, of reconciliation, and so forth. But when Ghani Khan puts the emphasis on once again here, mothers place Qurans on their heads once again is very, very crucial, that this is not a new code. This is just foregrounding. The framework of nonviolence is now foregrounding this code much more than Badal. And once again also ties in with the second Misra, the second line of this share. Once again, sisters have blackened their eyes. And so this is a reference to young women adorning themselves, so with makeup and kajal and so on. And that is only done when they are celebrating some kind of an occasion, because they would not blacken their eyes if they were in mourning. So instead of being in mourning for brothers or husbands or fathers who have been killed through these acts of revenge and retribution, they can now celebrate either their own weddings or maybe even finding suitors in the enemy's household. So the whole, this couplet shifts the code of Pashtunwali from Badal and from an ethos of forgiveness and life, essentially, a celebration of life, rather than ideas of death and revenge and violent retribution. And then the second couplet is really what Ghani Khan then complicates the whole thing a little bit more, and when he says, Baba's Pushtun vision told them tales of another kind. So the reference to Baba here is to Abdul Ghaffar Khan, both as his father, so Baba is the Pashto term for father, but also as Baba is also an honorific in Pashto for an elder, a wise elder. So Baba's Pushtun vision, so Baba Abdul Ghaffar Khan Bacha Khan, is situated in the Pashtun perspective, and that's the lens in which he is, through which he is viewing everything. Yet he is telling them tales of another kind. So yet this is a new kind of meaning-making framework, which is giving rise to new kinds of narratives for the Pashtun. So it's both a situation in Pashtunwali, but also not a reinterpretation, I would say, more interpreting what is already given in new kinds of ways. And I'm going to turn to one other poem of his that now situates Ghaffar Khan and the Khudai Khidmatgar movement in a particular vernacular version of Islam. And also he situates Ghaffar Khan, so the term pacifism would not be probably correct to use for the Khudai Khidmatgar nonviolence, because here and also in other literature of theirs, they consider nonviolence to be actually a battle that they are fighting. So it's a very active engagement, and the framework of nonviolence is also a very active form of resistance, both on epistemological grounds and even ontological grounds. If they're resisting representations of the Pashtuns. So I think the term nonviolence is probably more appropriate here than pacifism as such, because here in particular, Ghaffar Khan is situated in a lineage of Muslim warrior figures. So he starts off with, I actually can't see my top of my screen here, so I'm gonna, sorry. Okay. I think it starts with "Eh Khushal Baba." I can't see that line in my screen, but "Eh Khushal Baba, O Khalid, come and see. Rise Ali Murtaza, this spectacle come and see. To the battle now goes Mansur, neither guns nor armor bearing. The sword spark he does not flare, the arrow's music he does not strum. The enemy's might he will not see. Like a madman he keeps on going. Neither noose nor gallows does he see. This the Khan of all ecstatics, and the word that, the Pashto word is mastano, so mastano, intoxication, so ecstatics. This the Pashtun's mendicant, and the word is malang. This the Pashtun's mendicant, what colors of a king he bears. So the first 4 lines, the first 4 lines are a reference to legendary and mythic warrior figures. So Khushal Baba is a reference to Khushal Khan Khattak, the 17th century warrior poet. He was also a poet who was resisting Mughal domination, imperial Mughal domination of that area. And through his poetry, he also unified the Pashtuns to fight against imperial Mughal domination. And then O Khalid is a reference to Khalid bin Walid, the sword of Islam, as his title is, who then unified the Arab tribes and spread Islam throughout Arabia. And then Rise Ali Murtaza. Ali Murtaza is a reference to the 4th Khalifa of Islam, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law. But he's also a famed warrior figure, especially his crescent sword is a symbol of just war, if you will, of righteousness and justice and so on, and he fights in the name of that. So these are all legendary warrior figures that Ghani Khan is invoking and situating Ghaffar Khan in that lineage of warrior figures. But the other the really interesting turn that Ghani Khan makes now is to make Ghaffar Khan synonymous with Mansur al-Halaj. So to the battle now goes Mansur, neither guns nor armor bearing. So Mansur al-Halaj is, of course, the 10th century Islamic mystic, and that was in the Abbasid era of situated in Baghdad and during the Abbasid era, and his very he is a figure of mystical enlightenment in Islamic historiography, but especially as a poetic trope in Sufi literature and Sufi poetry. He is considered a symbol of enlightened resistance, if you will, because he uttered the words when he was supposed to have become enlightened. Mansur al-Halaj, when he was supposed to have become enlightened, he utters the word Anna al-Haqqa. Anna al-Haqqa is a reference to Haqq, is a reference to truth or reality. And so Anna al-Haqqa, I am the truth, I am reality. And of course, Haqq is then also one of the names of one of the 99 names of God. And so it became a little bit controversial, this utterance that I am the truth, when Mansur al-Halaj says that. But nevertheless, the Sufi tradition venerates that and situates that utterance in al-Haqqa in this broader framework, Islamic framework of Bahadat al-Wujud. And Wahadat al-Wujud is a concept that Ibn Arabi, of course, articulates much more in depth. But Mansur al-Hallaj is a figure that represents that tradition of Wahadat al-Wujud. And Wahadat al-Wujud is quite literally that the sacred is one body. But it means the unity.
Safoora, can you hear me? Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
We're running very late, and people need to have some lunch.
Just finishing up.
I want to give some chance for questions, which may indeed touch on Wahdat al-Wujud. We'll have to wait and see. Thank you.
I'm just going to finish up. This is my last poem that I'm going into. So that concept of Wahadat al-Wujud makes the sacred immanent into the creation, and that, of course, is then taken up by the framework of nonviolence. It goes very well with the framework of nonviolence. If all of creation is sacred and all of being of life is sacred, then you cannot inflict violence upon any aspect of it, because then you, in a sense, you will be inflicting violence upon the sacred. So for Ghaffar Khan to become the figure of Mansur al-Hallaj is a really sort of a crucial kind of perspective through which the Khudai Khidmatgars viewed him, and also situates the Khudai Khidmatgar movement in a particular vernacular kind of articulation of Islam that was prevalent at that time. So this reference would not be something that would not be familiar to the Pashtuns of that time. When he makes the reference to Mansur, it brings about this whole framework of. But Ghani Khan, and I won't go into the rest of the poem, of course, for the sake of time. But Ghani Khan really, through this poem, sort of very brilliantly situates, combines the sacred with the secular, and the political with mystical enlightenment, and the mystic, the Sufi mystic or the Islamic mystic now as the heroic warrior figure. So there's these very interesting combinations that are going on through, and the framework of nonviolence is making that legible without any direct reference to the framework of nonviolence or to nonviolence itself. And so Bacha Khan, I'll just end with the final lines when he says that he is a Pashtun's mendicant and what colors of a king he bears. That is a reference to his title, Bacha Khan, which means directly, literally means king. But he is pointing out that Bacha Khan means malang also, or a mendicant or a Sufi kind of figure who is now enlightening the Pashtuns through the framework of nonviolence. So I'll end there. Thank you.